Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Thank you for joining us as we read Honored Friend and Hero, written by Jeff Crawford, read by Cameron Buckner.
"16. He shivered and shook. Racking tremors rattled his entire body almost without end, unless he focused and gripped himself tightly. But they came again almost as soon as the last episode had stopped. Cold as he had never experienced had him in its clutches. He forced his teeth together and bit down hard as he tried to become one ferocious knot of limb and flesh and sinew. The fire was dying. He squirmed and writhed himself nearer to what remained, but felt no additional warmth after having done so. He was hugging himself beneath the furs that he had covered himself with. Maybe it helped a little, though he wasn't sure. The last thing he wanted to do was force an arm out from under his fur blanket, but if the fire were not improved, he had no idea what he would do when it finally went out. There was no way that he would survive the process of starting a new one. He wasn't all that sure that he would survive with the existing one. But still, it remained that he needed to do something before it was too late. With teeth chattering and clacking together and a soft, pitiful whimpering escaping him, he reached out and pulled his chair closer and then tipped it over to fall upon the small flames. The additional heat was not immediately felt, but the sound of wood crackling and popping as the fire began to eat at it reassured him, and he clutched at himself again under the hides of those animals that he had killed over the years. There was an infinite amount of coal left to be chipped away from the walls, but he did not know if he could stand, much less swing a heavy cold steel rifle barrel with any strength. And for a moment, he did not concentrate on the new warmth the blazing wood was providing. He thought instead of what he was going to do when his chair had become nothing more than ashes. He would still be without strength, and he would still be without stamina, and the room would begin to grow cold again. He peeked out from under his furs, and he saw the 2 pouches stowed under his bed. There was more than 5 pounds of gold nuggets and dust and flakes in each one now. He would gladly have given both just to be warm again and to be sipping a cup of hot tea like his mother used to make. His body shook violently again with chills, and he groaned. It had started just as a minor itch somewhere in the back and down toward the bottom of his throat. No matter how often he swallowed, he just couldn't seem to tame it. It wasn't worrisome, it was just extremely annoying. The emptiness of his life had become something of a routine, and things that changed that simple routine were annoyances to him. He had become extremely intolerant of annoyances. It had only been his better nature that had prevented him from eating 3 of the potatoes that he had snitched from the bin beside the smokehouse of the farmstead a few miles down the way last fall. The potatoes were good when fried in the dripplings from the meat that he was roasting. Good enough that he could have eaten 2 a night instead of just 1, and good enough that it had been a struggle to lay 3 of them by untouched. He had saved the ones with the most eyes so that he could plant his own hills, and by his count he should have 13 to plant, and if he ended up being fortunate, he would harvest potatoes of his own from 6 to 7 hills. He was hoping that the wildlife left him that many unmolested or destroyed. The animals that were around ate most anything, but for some reason they were not so fond of potato vines, and he hoped that worked in his favor. It was cool out first thing that morning, perhaps a bit early in the year for setting tater hills, but he decided to risk it. He had long ago figured out that trying to hide or make his plantings seem invisible did him no good. The animals around eventually found them anyway. Now he tried to put whatever he planted where they could catch the most sunlight. It wasn't the easiest thing to do, given how deep he was in the trees. He only had 2 potato slips left to bury when he had wiped the dirt from the side of his nose and frowned. He realized as he was wiping the dirt away that when he had pressed a finger against his nose so that he could blow it and clear away the obstructions, that it had been the 3rd time he had done that morning. He thought about the itch deep down in his throat, and he knew what lay ahead of him. Days, perhaps many as 8 or 10 of them, he would be blowing his nose and coughing and all the time feeling as if he needed to swallow, but knowing that it was going to hurt each and every time. His eyes would swell nearly shut, and he might even have a fever some of the time. He had been fortunate in that he had only taken the cold 3 or 4 times in the nearly 17 years that he had been living as he was. He sort of half smiled. He was fortunate in that he hadn't died during the first year. That damn tooth episode had tried its best to do him in also after he had been here a while. He nodded to himself, and if the rotten tooth hadn't killed him, then the dang spring cold wasn't likely to either, he didn't suppose. He knew that he would probably be uncomfortable for a few days, but it would pass. It didn't make a lot of sense to him to worry about what was going to happen. What made sense was getting the rest of his potatoes planted while he still felt reasonably well, and then go and fill his canteens to the brim with fresh water. Actually, he would need to fill them a couple of times. He needed to water his plantings before he went and put himself to bed, and maybe with enough warm rest he could beat the most of the sickness before it started. That was his hope anyway. He drank 2 large mouthfuls of fresh water after adding coal to the fire. The additional heat was near immediate and satisfying, and wrapped in his furs he closed his eyes and tried to remember if his mother had always said starve a cold and feed a fever, or feed a cold and starve a fever. He couldn't recall which way that pearl of wisdom had gone. Either way, he wanted nothing to eat. Earlier, before he had gone outside, he had cut himself a nice-sized piece of meat that he had roasted a few days prior. He managed to swallow 1 mouthful, but threw the rest away. It had tasted of iron or copper. He had thought that his meat had gone bad, but now he knew that it was the way everything tasted when you have a cold. Remembering that taste had been enough, whichever way the old saying went, he wasn't eating anything else for a while. Just before he closed his eyes, he reminded himself that while he still felt like it, he should break off a few days' supply of coal so that he would have it when he really was feeling poorly. He told himself that he would do it as soon as he awoke from the short nap that he was going to take, and Reuben fell asleep and did not wake again for nearly 7 hours. Years in this place had taught him to avoid making idiotic mistakes. Taking that nap before all was done that needed to be done had been a huge one. It felt like morning, but through the hole that served as an entrance, he could see that the sun was nearly set. The fire was low, too low. He had slept too long, and now the payment was due for his indulgence. He swung his legs over the side of what he called his bed and then sat there hugging himself with one arm while he used his free hand to rub vigorously at his knees, which were throbbing. He coughed, and it hurt down deep in his chest and in his back, and he wanted to have coughed something up so that he could spew it from his mouth. He believed that he would feel better if something were pulled from inside him and thrown away, but nothing came up. His knees and elbows hurt like the joints had rusted solid, and each movement to break them free caused him to scream in horror and agony. He never stood up, at least not completely. In a crouch, the way he had seen some elderly men walk, he made his way to the fire ring and slowly added a few fist-sized nuggets of coal to the small fire. The pieces he added were dribs and drabs that he had dropped over time. There was no supply ready at hand to draw from. Coal was everywhere, and it dawned on him that he had none to burn. The chills came upon him as he watched the flames grow and intensify. He should have given thought to later that night or tomorrow, but instead he shuffled back to his bed and pulled all the skin blankets that he had made from it and wrapped himself in them. In cocoon form, he lowered himself to the ground and laid by his fire. Even with the makeshift blanket pulled tightly around him, he worked until his knees were nearly to his chest. He had no idea if curling himself into a knot would help retain body heat, but it was what he felt like he needed to do. He coughed and did not cover his mouth as he had been taught to do, and he did not care. His hands were too busy holding the skins closed tightly around his body. Somehow, amidst the shivering and coughing, he began to drift off into sleep. He could feel the fire against his face, but it didn't seem to be providing any heat. He felt it, but he could not feel it. The fire burned brightly as he fell deeper and deeper into the black, but the fire diminished with each passing minute. When he awoke, he felt miserable still, even more so than he had when the tooth had acted up. Now he felt no heat upon his skin trying to worm its way in, only cold in his bones working its way out. He opened his eyes and concentrated on clearing his vision so that he could acknowledge what he might see. The flickers now and then of orange and red in the depths of the fire ring could be spotted, but there were no flames. The fire was all but gone now, and he wondered if it might not be easier to just go back to sleep and allow the life within him to go out as the fire was going to. He lay there and tried to will himself back to sleep, but the more he tried, the more the trying kept him alert to what he was attempting. A shout that hurt his mind echoed within his head, and over it yelled at him and would not be quieted until it had been accepted. You dishonored your father and your family's name by giving up and running away. You will not do it a second time by running from life. Each and every move instigated sharp and prickly cold shivers to run the length of his body. The more he moved, the colder he became. But he moved and continued to until he was standing, and he wavered, but he did not fall. He tried to take a deep breath, but it only induced a series of coughing spells that made him bend at the waist and grip at his knees until it had subsided. Breathing shallow now, he slid his feet along the dirt floor until he stood and stared down at the rifle barrel that he used as a miner would use a pickaxe. He knew it well. He knew how heavy it was, knew it would feel many times heavier in his current condition, and he knew it would be ungodly cold in his hands. He swung the length of steel with the same precision and strength that a tot might swing one of his father's tools. At first it seemed as if he would be ineffective. The steel seemed to merely bounce off the wall. But though his vision was blurred and the racking cough came continually to suddenly halt his work, he kept swinging. With his nose running freely and his sometimes weeping from the shuddering pain in his joints and the lack of progress he thought himself to be making, he kept swinging. And then the steel barrel simply fell from his hands, and he was only too aware that he could not grasp or lift it again. There was no such thing as bending over to grab the fragments of coal that he had chipped from the wall and then tossing them over near the fire. He was too exhausted and too light-headed. To bend was to fall, and there was no strength for lifting and tossing. Lacking grace, he fell to the dirt floor and began to collect all that he managed to loosen from the wall. And slowly he gathered the pieces into a pile. Always aware that the fire was dying just as surely as he felt like he was, he tried to hurry, but it did not seem possible to go any faster. Crawling and worming his way across the dirt, Reuben laid hard-fought coal upon what remained of his fire and sat there on his knees watching the flames as they began to grow. He held his trembling hands near to them and felt the heat. His back shivered from chills, but his hands were warm. He wanted to sleep, but he would not until he had finished his work. he had done differently earlier, and it had nearly been his undoing. He crawled back and forth from the wall to the fire ring, bringing pieces of coal with him each time, and when finished he was amazed and gladdened by the size of the pile his efforts had produced. He would have never thought that he had produced as much as he had, and he wrapped himself once more in his blanket of furs and positioned himself so that the pile of coal could be reached without getting up. He wanted a drink of water and knew that he should drink some just for the health benefits, but he wanted to sleep even more. The chills were still there, but now they weren't so violent as they had been, and the cough still gripped him suddenly and out of nowhere, but it had begun producing mouthfuls of slimy, thick substances that he gladly spat to the floor. The furs were soft and tender when he rubbed his running nose with them, much softer than a shirt sleeve. The blanket, made of pelts and hides, was catching the heat of the fire and retaining it. He closed his eyes, then breathed evenly and slowly, and then he knew nothing else. 17. The worst of it had lasted for 4 almost unbearable days, and then he awoke in the morning of the 5th one with his shirt damp from sweat. The blanket of fur felt good wrapped around him, but he was not cold like he had been. Now it was merely comfortable to be wrapped tightly beside the fire. And often he had fed the fire, and he must have, lest it would have died, but he did not recall doing it. His pants were dry, so he must have risen and relieved himself during those days, but he did not remember getting up. It took 10 more days of steady improvement before he felt more or less back to normal, but he ate regularly whether he was particularly hungry or not, and he rested often, and then soon enough he felt his strength returning to him. After watering his neglected potatoes, he stretched out in the bright mid-morning sunlight and lay his face to the sun. A lightly resting forearm covered his eyes. He turned his head and glanced over his left shoulder. Just down the ridge a little ways lay a pool that was fed by the small creek and spring. He gave thought to going down there later and getting in. It was comfortably cool now, but it would be warm by the middle of the afternoon. And the pool, though deepened and widened in recent summers, was still shallow enough that the water warmed quickly with its surroundings. He could use a bath, and aside from rinsing his face off a couple of times, Reuben had not bathed since before the sickness befell him. But that wasn't why he was thinking about the pool. He was lying in the sun and was comfortable, but he was also bored. He was wondering about retrieving some more mud and muck to sift through for gold. He didn't need any more, he just wanted something to do. He had thought about building another chair to replace the one he had burned, but his heart wasn't into the project. Living as he had for as long as he had and being accountable to only himself had taught him many things. Maybe chief among those was that if he wasn't totally committed to a thing, then he generally did a fairly poor job of it. The last thing he wanted was to be sitting comfortably by the fire one evening and the damn thing suddenly decide to fly apart and sprawl him into the dirt. It would be against the odds, but what if in the fall he somehow managed to break a hip? Stranger things have happened. That was something he could ill afford to have happen. The pealing of a bell reached his ears, and all that had been running through his mind suddenly disappeared. It was faint, but the sound was definite. He had heard it, and then heard it again. Slow and rhythmic, it repeated, over and over. Occasionally the timing changed and an extra tolling could be heard, but then went back to the same methodic pattern. He stood up too quickly and placed his hands against a tree to steady himself. The wave of dizziness was short-lived, and he knew it to be an after-effect of the recent illness. He was not yet as strong as he would like to have believed himself to be. Not running, but without question walking, a decidedly quicker pace than his usual, he went back to the coal shaft and retrieved his rifle after swallowing several deep pulls of water from his canteen. The water always seemed to help when the dizzy spells came. He listened with earnest after he had reemerged. It took a moment, but the sound was still on the breeze. He was cautious as he walked. It wasn't something he did because of the sound that he had heard. It was just his way, but he traveled faster than was his norm on this day. The sound he had heard, he had struggled often to hear it, so he knew it was not nearby. He would travel with alertness, but he could travel, and he thought, with safety as well as rapidity. His condition of boredom was now gone, and quite long forgotten. He drew closer to where he had thought the sounds to be coming from, but judging by the volume, when he was able to hear it, it didn't seem to him that he was gaining any ground. And then the thought occurred to him that he might be in pursuit of a moving target. The road that he had refused to return to, or at least the portion of where he had allowed William Sanders and his horse to die an awful and slow death, was where the sound seemed to be guiding him. He stopped and listened. The ridge was a great deal quieter when he wasn't moving, even though he moved in near silence. The tolling of the bell, or whatever that noise was, could now be heard better and more distinctly. It was almost a sure thing that it was coming from near to where Sanders had perished. He walked until he could see the road from where he stood. Not 50 yards below him was where he had turned his back and walked away, leaving the old man and the horse to die. He didn't want to go back to that place. He didn't want to look at the ground and remember how the man had looked as he had pleaded for help. Didn't want to recall vividly how the horse had looked as it screamed while it slowly suffocated under the weight of its own body. He could see those images well enough whenever he remembered, but he was of the mind that being down there would be worse. But nothing that caused the sounds was there. Still the sounds grew louder. He stood there and tried to see everything. The sound was definitely louder. He crept down another 20 yards and melted into a laurel thicket so he could watch. It wasn't a bell pealing. He knew what the sound was. He had heard it before. He was sure that he was not mistaken about that. He just couldn't identify it, and it kept growing louder. And soon, he thought, very soon, I will know the cause of all of it. Along with the tolling bell that was not a bell came other sounds as well. The clumping of hooves on a sun-dried hard clay road, the whistling of an ill-remembered tune, old boards creaking in the frame as the wagon wheels turned slowly, and pots and pans clanging together to make the sound of a bell being rung as the wagon progressed. Children singing a song different than the one that was being whistled, and Reuben watched as a family and all of their possessions passed below where he hid. Leaving something behind, maybe best forgotten, and on their way towards something new that was full of promise. That was what Reuben believed himself to be seeing, and he envied them. The wagon passed by, and he sat until he could no longer hear the sounds that it carried. Alone once again, surrounded by the quiet, he started back for his hole in the ground. He started back for home. He sat with his back against an oak and watched. The trees that had been little more than saplings when he had come to this place were now well on their way to becoming mighty. He had watched them do this thing, not like a father watches with pride as children grow. He had simply watched and occasionally took notice. It was all aside from existing that he had accomplished in all these years. As a younger man, he had never once thought himself destined for greatness, but surely there should be more. Even in this place, doing as he had, there should be more. He was now an old man, even though the calendar would say differently. The family that had passed by had been his life, happening all around him but not including him. They, just like life, would sleep tonight anxiously awaiting tomorrow and the promise that it held, while he sat watching the trees grow. Promises held by tomorrows. That was for others, the people who were not like him. For him, there were no tomorrows, only yesterdays that had not happened yet. When each day is the same as the one that preceded it, and the same as the one that had preceded that one, tomorrow and any promise it may hold becomes an illusion that is better left unimagined. To realize no change, no difference, no promise was to find yourself again in that place that is terrible, that place which is dark and hopeless, that place that is so easy to go but so very hard to leave, the place that is always dark because the sun only shines its light when the next tomorrow is born, and there are no tomorrows in that place, the same as there aren't any in his actual world. It isn't so simple as making the best out of every situation, as his father had always suggested that he do. If his father were here right now, he would see for himself what folly it had been to say such a thing and believe that a life could be bettered daily by thinking that way. Sometimes it simply can't be bettered, and when that realization finally comes, it is horrendous. But what is worse is existing in the knowledge of that for so long that you forget it, and then something comes along like a wagon did and reminds you all over again, and then you have to live through the realization again. Reuben had lost count of how many times he had been made aware of this truth by the fates, or the universe, or by whatever is responsible for unveiling them from time to time. Simply because of one decision that he had made half a lifetime ago, he was forced to know periodically that this was all there was ever going to be. It might get worse, but it would never get better. He thought about the wagon and the family that was riding in it, not about where it was going, but about where it had been. What could have been so bad that running away had seemed the best choice? He, better than anyone, understood that position, but what had they been faced with? He hoped for their sake that they had found a better tomorrow somewhere down the road that they were traveling. He knew what lay in the direction they had been traveling, at least for a few miles he did, but he wondered about the opposite direction. The old man that had died under the wheel had mentioned that he had recently been in a town just a few miles away. A town that Reuben could not recall the name of. It might pass by morning, but just now there was a desire to be in the town and see what there was to see. The urge to go might be gone by the time he awoke, but tonight he would sleep as those in the wagon would sleep, with a promise within tomorrow to look forward to. That hadn't happened in a long, long time. 18. He awoke as usual, and as usual he performed his necessaries. Then on the way to the pool to rinse his face and teeth, he remembered the plan that he had made the night before. With water dripping from his beard, he sat back and thought about it some more. The folks in that passing wagon had sent him headlong into a dark place, the place he didn't like going to, the place that is often hard to return from. Maybe it had just been a dark place that was telling him that he should go to the town. The dark place did that sometimes. It put thoughts and notions into his mind that he had no business giving the time of day to. It made him think of doing things that his normal, sensible self would never entertain the thought of. The dark place held up the truest needs and desires of his heart, made him stare at them with wide-open, unblinking eyes. He hated those things being brought to his attention. They should stay buried, just as his former life was. Buried and forgotten about, just as Reuben Miller, the former, had been. Everyone thinking all these years that he was dead had been a kindness gifted to them. Why couldn't he be gifted an equal kindness? Wasn't having everything that he had been and everything he should have been taken from him punishment enough for what he had done? Must he also be reminded of it all so harshly and so often? The sun would be up soon, he silently told himself as he looked around and he saw the wraith-like forms of fog weaving in and out of the trees. He thought about the notion he'd had the night before, the one that had allowed him to go to sleep with the possibility of a better tomorrow ahead. What if it hadn't been the dark inward place putting thoughts into his mind again, he thought? What if it had been an awakening of sorts? What if it really was permissible to go to the town and be once more among the living for a brief period of time? If the war was still raging, then it was raging somewhere besides here, he thought. I would have heard it if it were near, he told himself. I would have noticed men moving. Reuben had no doubts that the war machine could be still killing men as it had been when he had fled from it, but he didn't believe it to be doing so anywhere nearby. If the war was still bloodying the ground, then perhaps those that hunted deserters were near it also. Couldn't that be true? And wouldn't that be true? He asked himself. He raised up on his knees and leaned over to look at his own image in the water. The sun was providing light enough now for that. He had known what to expect more or less, but the image still caught him by surprise, and not in a good way. Tired and ravaged looking, just up from a full night's sleep, and still he looked worn and played out. His gray hair and beard encircled his face that was cut back and forth with the creases that should only be on a face twice the age of his. How many times had someone said, when he had been a younger man, that he had the bearing of his father, who had been regarded as a man pleasant to look upon? How many times had Starry gently caressed each side of his face with the tender palms of her hands and told him of how she longed to wake each morning just to see his face near to hers each new day? He would never hear those words again. He was no longer pleasing to look on. Now women would use their hands to cover their eyes at the sight of him instead of softly touching his cheek. He was monstrous and ancient-looking, though by the last count of the limbs in his crate only a few days earlier, he knew himself to be no more than 38 years of age. This worry-worn face that he must now wear forevermore was part of the punishment handed down to men who had done as he had done. Exile was not enough. There had to be more, apparently. It had to be so that he asked for the exile rather than just accepted it. He had to want to be isolated in order to escape the looks and whispers that were sure to come when he was seen. But the face that he no longer knew was the salvation as well. Those that might still be searching for him would not recognize him either. They would be looking for Reuben Miller, the 19-year-old man who had mysteriously disappeared some 18 years ago after a particularly horrendous day of carnage. They would not be looking for the skeletal vagabond that they were repulsed by when they cast their eyes upon him. Feeling his spirit lift somewhat by knowing his deplorable condition now made it possible, with extreme caution, to once again to enter the world of men, was not a feeling that anyone should ever have, he thought to himself. But it is the best I've had in many years, and as good as I am likely to have, he muttered to himself, as he walked back to his hole. It dawned on him as he walked that even after 18 years he knew very little about his surroundings. Not about the town a few miles away or the road that led to it. What he was thinking about was all of it. With each step, trees and ledges and ditches were new to him. He realized that everything about these forests should be known to him, but they weren't. He had never felt the need to know what lay over the ridge or down the way. The hole where he lived was safe. He knew where to get water and meat, and he knew where 3 farmsteads sat for when he needed seedlings for plantings or pants to steal from a drying line. There had been no need to know more than that, and now he was frightened, even as he continued to move forward along the ridge, but always with the road within sight. He didn't like unfamiliar things. It was dangerous. He wanted his rifle in his hands, but someone that looked like he did and was carrying a rifle that fine was sure to arouse curiosity. So it had been left in the hole when he had walked out. He was being cautious, he told himself. He wasn't covering ground as quickly as he knew he should be, so he blamed it on caution, but he was dawdling. He knew that, too. Asking Starry to take that first walk with him had been like this. It had been something he had very much desired to do, but was so scared of asking her that he had dragged his feet leading up to his walking up to her. This was like that had been, only much, much worse. She could have said no or laughed when he had asked her, and he would never have been able to look her in the eyes again, but this could get him killed. No one would be disappointed if he turned around and went back to his hole. Why would they be, since they didn't expect him or even know that he existed? There would be a certain measure of shame to live with if he did that. Shame for being afraid to do a thing, but the past 18 years had taught him that he could live with the shame. It was simply a matter of adding it to the list of things that he would regret as he closed his eyes for the final time. That might be the thing that he was always aware of, but never talked about with himself. He was fearful of acknowledging his greatest regrets. To fear them, and how profound they might be, was one thing, but to openly admit them and then explore them to know exactly how deeply they went was another. He had yet to reach the level of inner strength where he had thought he could stand knowing that. He had been walking while he had been thinking of these things and had not even realized it. When Reuben looked through the small opening in the trees, he could see the roofs of buildings. The contents of his stomach spewed up through his throat and out onto the ground. He saw more people in the first 5 minutes than he had seen altogether in 18 years, and he had not made it yet to the town proper. No one had seen him yet, and he hadn't meant for them to. He was crouched among the bushes near the side of the road that bisected the town. He was close enough so that he could hear the men talking. There were so many, and everyone seemed to be talking at one time. He couldn't isolate conversations. He wanted to eavesdrop and hear the biggest issues of the day. And on the edge of this small town, he wanted to hear all the important things of the world. He wanted to hear all that he had missed out on over the last 18 years. He wanted to know all that everyone was already aware of, and he wanted to know it from his place of concealment in the bushes, with its leaves covering in dust from the nearby road. But he supposed that that was too much to ask. He watched. They weren't dressed so differently from him thanks to the clothes that he had stolen not so terribly long ago, but theirs were considerably cleaner. They all wore hats. He had not worn one since he had lost his running from the battlefield. There were guns, nestled in rifle scabbards or propped up against the wagon seats, but no man was carrying a firearm that he could see. But the thing that surprised him the most was the absence of uniforms. None, neither gray nor blue, were anywhere to be seen. Even if the war was still being contested 1,000 miles away, he would have thought there would be a presence from one side or the other in the town. Once a town had been conquered and claimed, it had been a practice of both sides to leave a force of some number, but he saw none. He supposed that in a place as small as this, it had been deemed unnecessary. He started to rise and make his way closer, perhaps go ahead and even enter the town, but what he saw made him sit back down in wonderment. He didn't know what business the shop or store did. He couldn't tell from where he sat, but all three of them were going to go inside. There was a black man in a very white shirt and bib overalls reaching the door at the same time that a white man and presumably his wife had. The black man took off his hat and smiled at both of them, and the white man opened the door and held it open for the black man to enter first. Reuben had never known but a handful of black men before going to fight, and he had liked all of them very much. He liked them much more than some of the white men that he had known. His deciding to fight had nothing to do with a man being one color or another. He had liked all the black men he had ever known and counted them as friends. But not all had thought as he had. In fact, most that he had grown up around had not thought as he had. So to see a white man hold the door open for a black man was something that he would never have imagined seeing, but he was glad that he had. He tried to look determined as he walked. He wanted to give the impression that he had something important to attend to. It was his hope that people would be less likely to bother with him if he seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere so that an errand could be taken care of. It seemed as he walked through the small town of Hamilton that no one was paying any attention to him, no matter how he carried himself. But just because he couldn't feel anyone noticing him, it did not cause him to feel any safer about his situation. With each step, he was sure that his bowels would loosen and spill onto the street. He wanted to satisfy himself that he had seen all that there was to see and then beat a hasty retreat back to his hole. But never had he wanted to shut away from people so badly as he wanted that now. A man carrying a large and heavy-looking burlap sack on his shoulder came out of the door first, and he was followed by a small boy that seemed to be heartily enjoying a stick of striped candy. The man went back and closed the door after falling the sack from his shoulder into the bed of the wagon and then planting the boy upon the wagon seat. As the father and son drove away, Reuben stared at the door that opened into the Hamilton General. As scared as he had ever been, he stepped from the street onto the boardwalk and extended a hand to grip the door latch. 19. Reuben wasn't entirely sure of just what he had been expecting, but for some reason, people milling around inside of the store wasn't it. There weren't many folks, only 2 or 3 aside from the lady behind the counter, but considering where he had been for the past 18 years, the store still looked crowded to him. They had all turned and faced the door when he had opened it and made the small brass bell above it begin to jingle. Since no one in the store knew him, most everyone returned to their shopping straight away. One woman did not try to hide her disgust at the way he looked, but she turned aside soon enough, as if not seeing him meant that he wasn't there. So many things. Of course, he had frequented stores in an earlier life, but he had forgotten what it was like for so many different things to be available to just pick up and have, if you had the money to buy them with. The lady behind the counter was busy at something, but told him to have a look around and give a shout if he needed help finding something in particular. Reuben didn't answer. He did nod, though, in acknowledgement, but she didn't see him do that. He stood still and nearly wept as he smelled the air around the wood stove. He had forgotten just how pleasing the aroma of brewing coffee was. He and his father used to drink a pot between them each morning before starting their labors. His mother would sit and smile as she watched those that she called her men eating breakfast and drinking coffee while she sipped at her tea. And he had thought often over the 18 years about how good a cup of coffee would taste, but he had never imagined the strength of memories just the smell of it would invoke. You are welcome to sniff the air all you like if that's what you want to do, but you can also pour yourself a cup if you like. I put a pot on a couple of times a day for anyone who might fancy some, the lady behind the counter said. Reuben looked around the store just in time to see the last customer besides himself walking out the door. You'd be offering that cup to me, miss? He asked. I'm offering you 2 cups if you'd like it. Now this time of day, people stop taking in coffee. And I don't know why I keep making 2 pots when I always throw most of the second one out each day. So go on and help yourself. I'd rather see one man drink it all than have to pour it out, she said. Reuben was embarrassed for a moment as he looked at his dirty fingernails and beaten-up hands, but the temptation proved to be too great, and he grabbed a tin cup and he filled it. Miss, do you mind if I drink this while I walk around and look at your wares? I swear I won't spill a drop on anything or on your nice floor, Reuben said. She looked up from her work and tried to recall if she had ever heard such genuine manners coming from such an unlikely source before. You just make yourself at home and look all you want. You can't buy it if you don't see it, can you? She asked. Reuben smiled and began to meander down the aisle. She watched him and taxed her brain to remember if she had ever seen him before. Generally, she had a fair memory for faces, especially the usual ones, and his was definitely one of those, but she just couldn't place him. Still, there was something about him that kept poking at her, as if he were somehow familiar to her. Never one to shy from a conversation, she laid her pencil aside and rose from the stool that she was sitting on. He was studying a small box that he had taken from the shelf. He had a confused look on his face as he read the writing on the box. "Now those are therapeutic papers, and they're for you to take to the outhouse instead of the Cobbs," she said. Well, he dropped the box when he heard what he was holding, but she caught it before it landed on the floor. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. You just looked confused as to what was inside the box," she said. "Oh, I never heard of such. My, oh my, what people will spend their money on," he said. She giggled and placed the box back onto the shelf. She was fair certain that he would not be purchasing those. "Miss, I saw something in a carton over there, and I'd like to ask if it truly is what I believe it to be, if I may," he asked. "My name is Maggie Neal, so from now on you call me Maggie instead of Miss. And if you will lead the way, I will tell you exactly what it is that you were wondering about, because I was probably the one that ordered it," Maggie said. He smiled and started walking. The route took them past the wood stove where he refilled his cup with coffee. No matter where the item in question had been located, he would have found a way to walk near that pot again. And it was her time to smile as she watched him close his eyes and enjoy another long, slow sip. "I never felt as if anyone ever thought much of my coffee," Maggie said. "Well, let them go without a cup for as long as I have, and they will think differently, I assure you," he said. "Now, where are you from, if you don't mind me asking? I can't remember ever seeing you in here before," Maggie said. "Never been in here before. I live out east of here a fair piece, and just felt like taking a walk. I happened up on this place, and I decided to stick my head, and then the rest of me inside your door," he said. She nodded and seemed to be taking him at his word. Reuben was glad of that, seeing as his hole was nearly 6 miles west from where they were standing. He didn't think it would come up, but if it did and men were ever sent out to look for him, at least they would start off in the wrong direction. "Well, wherever you're from, I'm glad to have you in the store today. Now show me what it is that you're curious about, and I'll see if I can help you," Maggie said. They arrived in front of the shelf, and he pointed to the box that lay on the bottom one. It wasn't overly wide, and it wasn't very thick, but it was 3 or more feet long. "Now that cannot be what it says it is, can it?" he said. "It truly is," she said. "I ordered 2 of them thinking I would get rich off of them, but one is still here and the other is in my front room." "How on earth did someone manage to get a rocking chair inside of that box?" he asked. "It hasn't been constructed, or as they say on the label, it needs assembling, and it's very easy to do. Now I know because I put the one that I have together all by myself. There's a sheet of paper inside the box that tells you each step that you are to make, and it even comes with a jar of glue. I put mine together, and once I knew that I had it done correctly, I took it back apart and then glued everything as I went. It sits nicely as any rocker made in Vermont," she said. "Well, I'll be dipped. I never heard the likes before," he said. "If you're interested in it, I'll sell it to you for what it costs me, just to make some room on the shelf for things that folks around here might actually want now and then," Maggie said. "Well, can I study on it for a minute or two? Would you permit me that?" he asked. "You take all the time that you need. I'll just be over there if you decide on it." She said this before she walked away with more optimism at getting rid of the thing that her father always referred to as a folly. Reuben was already thinking about how nice it would be to sit in a proper rocking chair by his fire ring each night. "Did you make up your mind?" she asked as he approached the counter. "Well, it depends on how you want to trade on it, I expect," he said. "Well, $12 is what I paid for it, and that's what I would take for it," she said. "Well, I like that chair, or I think I would like it once it's been all put together. I don't have any folding money, though," he said. "I'd sure like for you to have it, but I can't give things away for free, except for the coffee, of course," Maggie said. Well, I wasn't asking for it to be given to me. I don't have any folding money, but I have gold if that will do anything for you, he said. You have gold? I do. Probably enough to buy that chair, he said. You have gold on you now. I don't deal in gold, but Wadecliff down at the bank does. You can go down there and trade it in for folding money or for silver coins if you prefer, Maggie said. Reuben was shaking his head back and forth before he started speaking. Well, I have no desire nor plans to go to any bank, he said. He pulled a few inches out before a small patch made from the hide of a rabbit followed it from inside his pants. He dropped it onto the counter and then pointed at it. It had made a heavy, dull thud when it landed on the wood. Now, I don't know how much is there, but I'm thinking it's heavier than a pound. Do you have scales near to hand? He asked. Maggie didn't say anything as she lifted the pouch and walked over to where she weighed out flour and sugar and coffee for customers. She handed it back to him and told him that since it was his, maybe he ought to be the one to open the pouch and pour the contents on the scale. Well, he shrugged his shoulders and began to untie the pouch. She watched it glitter and flicker as it landed in the pan, and he poured until there was more than 1.5 pounds lying there. Where did you get all this? She asked. Would you take what is there for that chair? There might be more inside that purse if you was to turn it inside out and look real hard, he said. I couldn't take all of this for a $12 chair. I don't know how much gold is worth, but what you have here is worth more than $12, I know that much, Maggie said. Would you take it if I said that whatever might be left over after the cost of the chair has been taken away was for the 2 cups of coffee and the nicest conversation I've had in quite some time? He asked. Now, this is too much. I wouldn't feel right about making a trade like this, Maggie said. Well, I'd wager that you can find a better use for that gold than I can. I need to be going, and I'd like to be taking the chair with me when I go. Have we struck a bargain or not? He asked. Well, yes, Lord, yes. If you're happy with the trade, then I am as well, Maggie said. Well, that's good, he said as he smiled. Now I'll be collecting my chair now, and I'll get out from under your feet, he said. You follow me over to the counter, and I'll write you up a sales ticket for the purchase, and I'm going to give you a couple of paint brushes also. They'll help you to put that glue on, Maggie said. I have no need of any ticket, but I would thank you for the brushes. He leaned the box against the counter while she rummaged through a carton for 2 4-inch painting brushes. That was the size that she used on her own chair, and it had worked quite well for her. He was rereading all the words on the outside of the chair's box as she was dropping the brushes into a narrow brown paper bag. I cannot wait to write today's experience down in a letter to send to my friend. She's going to be amazed as I have been, Maggie said. And why would she be amazed that you sold a chair? He asked. It's been nearly 15 years since that war ended, and times are still hard for most people. She knows that most of the sales this store does is done on credit. People just can't seem to find a way to dig out from their hardships. And then one day a man comes in with all this gold and gives it to me for a rocking chair. Now that story will make her smile, and I don't think many things do that these days. We write each other on a regular basis, and I try to tell her something that will make her smile if I can, Maggie said. The news that the war had been over for so long had set him back on his heels, but he worked hard to keeping his face calm and expressionless. There would be plenty of time to think about all this as he walked back to his hole and then later sat in it. He knew that many evenings would be spent considering what he had just heard. Your friend, is she feeling poorly? Is that why she no longer smiles? He asked, in as normal a tone of voice as he could manage. No, she isn't ill, not so far as I know. Her husband passed not so long ago, and she and her daughter went back to live with her family. There were some real special moments there that she was looking forward to being near again, memories that were very dear to her. But from what she has written, those memories aren't enough. I think being around them saddened her more than they brought her the joy that she was hoping they would, Maggie said as she handed him the bag. Memories can be treasures, but they can also be cruel and edgy. They are kind to you when you go to find them, but when they come up on you all on their own, they can sting and bite in a painful way. You cannot run from them because they are attached to you and they are always there, and they assault you when you least expect them to, he said. Well, you speak as if you are an authority on memories, both good and bad, Maggie said. Write your friend what you will and hope that your words cause her to smile. There are too few smiles in this world for you to be withholding one if you have it to give, he said. Oh, I will write her, but I will do more than that. I'm making plans so that just as soon as I am able to get away, I'm going to travel to Marion, Virginia, and give my friend Starry the biggest hug you ever saw. I'm going to forbid her to do anything other than smile for the duration of my visit, Maggie said. Reuben wavered, but acted as if he had gotten his feet tangled up with the box that was leaned against the counter. There was no point in wondering if the shopkeeper was referring to someone that he didn't know. There was only one Starry in Marion. His Starry. His Starry who had been married but no longer was. His Starry who had a child to raise, but no one to help her do it. His mind was reeling too quickly for him to keep up with the new thoughts that were coming in from every direction. Besides, I've never met her daughter Ruby, and I very much would like to do so. She was named after one of those memories that my friend went back to visit. And I want to meet someone that was named for such a special remembrance, Maggie said. Reuben needed to leave. He needed to be away from this place. He needed to be in his hole where he could think about all that he had heard. He lifted the box to one shoulder and shoved the bag of brushes into his pants pocket. I hope that you will come back and visit the store again, Maggie said as he grasped the door latch. Reuben didn't trust himself to speak. He nodded and walked outside into the bright sunlight. 20. He had wanted to run from the store as soon as he had heard what Maggie said. He wanted to run all the way back to his hole, but he had forced himself to walk steadily and without having the look of singular intent written across his face. As far as he knew, he had emerged from his hole, had engaged with people for the first time in 18 years, save the old man under the wagon wheel, and was leaving again with none being the wiser as to who or what he was. To have torn out running the moment he hit the street would have called far too much attention. Attention was something that he never wanted, but now of all times was when he could afford it the least. But when he was safely back among the trees and atop the ridges, he did not tarry. He ran as fast as he could for as long as he could. It wasn't like it had been when he had been a young man. Age, a toe that never healed quite properly, a carton full of rocking chair balanced on his shoulder all made the deciding difference. Still, he ate up ground and began to recognize trees and outcroppings no more than 2 hours after he had been talking to that girl Maggie. Once he arrived, he slid the box down the hole ahead of himself and then kicked it underneath his bed. He drank all the water that remained in his canteen and then lay down on his bed. There had been other things in that store that he had wanted and could have used badly, but at the time he didn't know how he could carry everything to his place. As it turned out, he was exceedingly glad that he had decided to leave it where it lay on the shop shelves. The handles of the painting brushes were gouging at him. He pulled the bag and brushes from his front pant pocket and tossed them on the floor halfway across the room. Starting his rocker was the very last thing on his mind now. Just the mere mention of her name had been enough. Just hearing the word Starry had stirred and created havoc inside of him that he might have thought impossible. Not that his feelings for her or his memories of her had faded over time, because they hadn't. It was just that he didn't think simply hearing her name would bring everything flooding back with such force. What was he to do now? He wondered as he lay on his bed of twigs and furs while looking up at the ceiling of the coal shaft. Now that he knew her situation, which he had been wondering about for all these 18 years, now that he knew that she had not waited forever like she had said that she would, and that he had secretly been hoping that she still was, and now that he knew that she was alone, except that she had a daughter beside her, was he to go running back all the way to Virginia to sweep her up into his arms? Was he to cast pouches of gold at her feet so that she would know that she never need worry about providing for her daughter ever again? Was he to stand before her and expect her to welcome him back after being gone so long? What was he to say when she asked where he had been for the better part of 2 decades? And she would ask, if not demand, that answer. Was he to have faith that she would hear the thoughts that he'd had in the time of war and understand his decision? Would she see him as he who was once dear to her and was now returned to her? Or would she see him for the coward in disgrace that had huddled in a hole away from the world for half of his life? What if she did accept him back into her loving embrace? Would she have given thought to her daughter's future before doing so? Just because Starry might welcome him back into her life, that did not mean that everyone would. What would those who didn't so readily forgive him say to her daughter as she grew about the man that her mother had taken up with? Would Starry uproot their lives and move in the hopes that no one ever found out what a disgrace he really was? Would she be trying and struggling to accept him back, even as she was saying defiantly that she had? Would she still be harboring enough feelings for he that she had married and buried, that there was no room left for him now? Would she ever believe that the reason that he had been gone for so long that he really hadn't known that the damn war was finally over? Would anyone ever believe such a thing, even though it was the truth? What would his returning do to his own family? It had only been 18 years, so there was no reason to assume that one or both of his parents might not be still living. What would his return do to them? Would it matter how much gold he gave them as a way of making up for his actions? Was there any way in the world that his actions could be atoned for? How many times was he to ask for forgiveness while reminding them that he had been a young and very frightened young man when he had done what he had done? And could he ever apologize enough? And could his father ever explain enough to his friends and neighbors so that they would finally just be happy that their friend's long-dead son had returned from the grave instead of focusing from now on about how he'd been hiding in that grave all this time? He needed something to eat, but he felt no desire to eat. Too much had happened that day, and it was wearing on him. He wanted to close his eyes and shut it all away for a time, and he needed to begin again to think about all of this, but when he had a clearer mind. There were too many thoughts, and they were all stomping their feet for attention inside his mind. The confusion was equal to, if not greater than that which he had run from on the battlefield. He did not think that he could run from his own thoughts. Many were the times that he had wished that and found no success in trying. The sleep did come. It had not been of his doing, it simply came. And when the body is exhausted, sleep comes to be restorative, as it also comes when the mind needs rest. Somewhere in the midst of all those thoughts, the mind began to waver, and sleep took him over. If he dreamed, he did not remember doing so. Neither were there any sudden and jarring awakenings during the night, so that he could return to his thoughts, and they lay quietly by the side until the morning. Morning came, and brought a clarity of mind. All the thoughts were still there to be gone through, but they were more organized now. The night before had been a jumble to sort out, but now he could see them all, and had the ability to pick and choose which ones he wanted to study in detail. He chose none of them. He had awakened knowing that the decision had been made somehow during the night. To see his father and mother again, to see his home again, to hold Starry in his arms and breathe in the scent of her skin again. 18 years in this place had taught him many things, and chief among those was that he would have given almost anything to see those that were so dear to him again. But with the clarity that the night had brought also came the knowledge that he no longer deserved that which he wanted the very most. And more importantly, those that he treasured so did not deserve the pain that his return would bring. The weight that he would attach around their necks by simply coming home was not something he could do to them. It would be wrong, and hadn't he done enough wrong to them already? After washing his face at the pool, he returned to the hole, and at some point he would need to repair his snares that had been left unattended, but now he had another chore waiting. He dragged the box out from under his bed and began to open it. He needed to get the chair assembled. He was going to be here for a long time, it appeared. He might just as well spend the time in relative comfort. In that chair, he could think at length about what might have been. 21. She sat on the same log that she had always sat on. For some reason, it never seemed to be trying to rot away. She watched as Ruby tossed pieces of stale bread to the ducks. They were content out in the pond, and their paying Ruby's insistence that they come to eat no mind at all, was infuriating the little girl. She read the latest letter from Maggie, and she did smile as Maggie had hoped that she would. Starry hoped that if she ever made it back to her friend's store, the odd man with the nice manners would happen in while she was there. She would pleasure in meeting him, she thought. This has been Honored Friend and Hero, written by Jeff Crawford, narrated by Cameron Buckner. Copyright 2023 by Jeff Crawford. Production copyright by Jeff Crawford.
This concludes the story of Honored Friend and Hero by Jeff Crawford. We hope you have enjoyed this story. You can find more of Jeff Crawford's books on Amazon. This podcast was brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please join us next week as we begin the story of Timber, U.S. Marshal by Robert Hanlon.